Thank you, Samir, and welcome everyone. The post-lunch sessions are always a challenge, but I think that's why Samir kept probably the most exciting panel for the post-lunch session today. In 2017, the new buzzword was resurrected. It's called Indo-Pacific and the Quadrilateral, balancing China's expansionist power play. Has brought countries like India, Japan, US, Australia, and yes, Indonesia on the same stage. But as the geostrategic significance of the Indo-Pacific grows, the stakeholders need to work really hard to strengthen a regional security architecture, whether we call it the Quadrilateral or we call it by any other name. We all have to answer one question when we look around. What is this rules-based order that we are trying to enforce in the Indo-Pacific region? How, for instance, shall we enforce the rules of freedom of navigation? How far will we go to maintain the rules of an international order in a geopolitical space that must also accommodate aspirations of rising powers? We are in the process of building plurilaterals, trilaterals, quadrilaterals, all with a general goal in mind. But it's time to add the detail to this piece of geopolitical art. What are the strategies in place? And equally, what should we avoid? Japan, US, India, and Australia have rekindled the Quad. How will they synergize their actions in the Indo-Pacific? Is it interoperability we seek, or are we just going to, is this just going to be a diplomatic or an economic exercise? Are we just going to be sharing information, or is it something deeper? The most important theater for cooperation is in the maritime sphere. For as the Australian Defence Minister Marie Payne recently said, if the 21st century is the Asian century, it is also the maritime century. Our naval capabilities will therefore be integral to the preservation of a rules-based order and of safeguarding peace in the Indo-Pacific. It is significant today that we have the practitioners to give us our thoughts and to find that strategic meeting ground. We've heard a lot of the rhetoric. Now it's time for the boots on the ground. I will begin by asking Admiral Lanba to open the batting order. And we will take introductory remarks from the panelists, then answer a couple of questions, and then open it up to the audience. Admiral Lanba.
Thank you, Indrani, for the introduction. It's an honor and pleasure to be part of this discussion on an issue that is of seminal importance for global peace and well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come straight to the subject. The Indo-Pacific region is predominantly a maritime space, straddling across both Indian and the Pacific Ocean. Though I chose to use the word predominantly maritime, I do not intend to underplay the significant continental connotation of this region. I am sure the audience is well apprised of the factors that make the Indo-Pacific region the nucleus of global geopolitics and geoeconomics in the 21st century. The rapid and robust economic development in the region has catalyzed an accompanying widespread military buildup. While such trends are not unusual, a high degree of ambiguity in the strategic intentions of such nations remains a concern. Consequently, the region is facing a deficiency of trust, giving rise to widespread unpredictability and in some sectors, even instability. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what we must seek to address. It is the shared vision of almost all stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific to establish an environment of peace and security. In India's context, this is enshrined in the vision of Sagar as articulated by our Honorable Prime Minister. Sagar literally means the ocean and stands for security and growth for all in the region. And the Indian Navy accordingly seeks to work in close coordination with other stakeholders in the region to build up mutual understanding, trust, and interoperability. This would then allow us to evolve mechanisms to complement each other's effort and thereby ensure a favorable and a positive security environment. Simultaneously, we seek to promote adherence to established international law and respect for mechanisms through which these are enforced. We believe that such an approach will allow nations of the region to actively pursue their own interests freely and also ensure collective peace and prosperity. Going forward, we seek to work closely with regional nations towards establishing transparency and openness. Transparency is key to lasting peace. For transparency to exist, a constant dialogue is essential, and initiatives such as the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, the recently held Goa Maritime Conclave, or the Milan series of exercises in the Andamans are aimed at providing platforms for interaction, and we will continue to lay thrust on these constructive dialogues. Exercises such as Malabar, GIMEX, OS Index with like-minded nations are extremely useful for fostering cooperation and interoperability, thereby enhancing transparency, something that my co-panelists will also vouch for. This would, in due course, facilitate policy coordination. In recent times, national leaders across the Indo-Pacific have displayed a distinct maritime inclination in their outlook. Such conversion of views amongst national leaderships must be taken forward by respective maritime agencies. Now, let me highlight some challenges that we would encounter. The first challenge that we need to overcome while formulating multilateral institutions or shaping coalitions is the diversity of the region, be it political, cultural, or economic. India has always believed in unity and diversity, and achieving political congruence between participating nations is a prerequisite for shaping multilateral institutions. The core philosophy of these institutions must show respect for strategic autonomy for each participating nation, and I believe the present meeting of minds of several nations of the region at the Raisina Dialogue offers an opportunity that must be seized. The second aspect that would need to be addressed is the capability and capacity differential between various security forces in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, any multilateral effort to succeed, it is imperative that suitable technologies and resources are shared and made available where required. I believe that in order to overcome these challenges, nations need to arrive at issue-based consensus for a defined period of time. During this period, cooperative efforts should be catalyzed by capacity and capability development. This will enable and empower partner nations to contribute effectively to the unified objective. In the end, I would like to reiterate that a free, open, and prosperous and an inclusive Indo-Pacific region would best serve the long-term interests of all the countries in the region and the world at large. And the IN remains committed to translating this vision into reality in the realms of the maritime security. In pursuit of safe and secure seas, we would remain deeply engaged with like-minded nations and navies in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. And thank you.
Thank you, Lanba. Thank you, Admiral Lanba. Admiral Harry Harris, this is your third Raisina Dialogue, so welcome back. And we are waiting to hear your perspective on how this space is to be managed.
Well, thank you, and I'll just begin by saying if I sound a little giddy, it's because I am, because I've read your work for years in the Times of India, so I'm honored to be up here with you on the dais. Let me thank the Foreign Secretary and Ashok and Samir and the entire ORF Raisina Dialogue team for having me back yet again to participate in Raisina. This is my third and final time to be with you as the PACOM commander. It's been a real honor for me to partner with you in the Ministry of External Affairs to build a venue that encourages the kind of discourse that is so needed given today's security environment. 2 years ago, I suggested that India and the United States must strive to be ambitious together if the Indian Ocean region was going to reach its full potential. I stressed the need for multilateral frameworks that focused on like-minded nations, building regional capacity to address the challenges that threaten the security and prosperity of the region. Now, I was roundly criticized by some for suggesting that we relook at the quadrilateral format. Last year, I returned and outlined the significant progress that the United States and India had made in our bilateral relationship. While the relationship continues to strengthen, I highlighted that neither side was satisfied with the progress. I stated that the drive and persistence that we would share would make the India-U.S. relationship the single most important relationship to the future of both of our countries in the early parts of the 21st century. So in 2016, the key word for the India-U.S. relationship, from my perspective, was ambitious. In 2017, it was persistence. And now in 2018, for the third Raisina Dialogue, let me suggest that that word is courage. And as I look out to the present security landscape in the Indian Ocean and in the Indo-Pacific, I believe that 2018 is the year to take courageous action to get things done, to finish those things that we began in 2016, we reinforced in 2017, but we have yet to realize. I think 2018 is that year. We must be willing to make the tough decisions to ensure that the Indo-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region specifically remains free, open, and prosperous. This requires like-minded nations to develop the capacity to address the challenges that we face together by leveraging each other's capabilities and realizing that the whole is indeed much greater than the parts. Conventional thinking is often the easiest thing to do, but that doesn't make it the right thing to do. Leadership requires us to lead from an unshakable core of conviction, even if we are unpopular in that. We must be willing to say what we believe to be true and let people decide if our deeds and words reflect our real intentions. This is the legacy of like-minded nations that embrace the free, open, prosperous, and inclusive Indo-Pacific that Admiral Lanba spoke about. So it's my hope that this is what Raisina continues to represent for the region, a forum that assembles courageous people who want to advance multilateral efforts across the region to improve the lives of all of our peoples. So thank you for having me back, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Admiral Harris. Admiral Katsutoshi Kawano, the Chief of Staff of the Joint Staff of Japan. The floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing your perspectives on this region.
Yes. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairperson, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to meet you all today. I am Admiral Kawano, Chief of Staff, Joint Staff, Japan Self-Defense Forces. I am delighted that this is the first time for Japan Ministry of Defense to participate in the Raisina Dialogue. Naturally, this is also the first time for general and flag officers of Japan, India, United States, and Australia to lead a session of Raisina Dialogue together. I am truly excited to speak at such a historic opportunity. Nowadays, there are various factors of instability in the global security environment, and these are becoming increasingly acute. Within the global security situation, there is a growing risk that unrest or a security problem in a single country or region could quickly develop into a challenge or a destabilizing factor for the entire international community. Looking now at the theme of this panel, maritime security, the rule of law based on the international laws, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, plays an important role in maintaining maritime order. However, recent years have seen increasing moves and attempts to unilaterally change the status quo based on unique claims. In addition, issues such as piracy, illegal fishing, and drug transactions are increasingly threatening the status, a stable use of the global commons. The inflow of international terrorist groups can also become destabilizing factors for the region. These challenges are especially obvious in the Indo-Pacific region, and there is a concern that the sovereignty and the national interest of the countries involved could further complicate and escalate the situation. Japan now possesses the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. This strategy is based on the understanding that the key for stability and prosperity of the international community is a dynamics that is created by combining the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, the two free and open oceans, and that the free and open rules-based maritime order is a cornerstone of the peace, stability, and prosperity of the international community. This region, spanning between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, will likely become the center of global prosperity. Therefore, promoting peace and stability of this region is in the best interest of the international community as a whole. We need to promote common values to ensure a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific so that this region can continue to thrive. These common values include free and open economies, the rule of law, freedom of navigation, making open, transparent, and non-exclusive use of infrastructure. This is why Prime Minister Abe advocates the three principles for the rule of law at sea: make claims based on international law, not resort to force or caution to drive these claims, and settlement of disputes by peaceful means. With this in mind, I would now like to touch upon some of the initiatives undertaken by the Japan Self-Defense Forces to realize a stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific as well as open and stable seas. The first point is joint training and exercises. The Japan Self-Defense Forces takes various training and exercise opportunity to strengthen cooperative relationship and build confidence with other countries. One excellent example, still fresh in everyone's memory, is the Japan-India-US maritime exercise, Naval, held here in India last July. In addition to this, we participate in the US-led Pacific Partnership and the Proliferation Security Initiative maritime interdiction exercises with Australia and the United States, as well as exercises under the framework of ADMM Plus Experts Working Group, in which all of our 4 countries participate. Through this, we promote confidence building and mutual trust among different militaries and contribute to the peace and stability of the region. The second point is counter-piracy. For coastal nations, it is crucially important to strengthen the basic rules based on order, including the freedom of navigation, and to ensure safety of maritime traffic. In order to ensure the maritime order and the safety of the sea, JSDF has been deploying destroyer and patrol aircraft off the coast of Somalia and in the Gulf of Aden since 2009. Since 2013, we have also been a part of the Combined Task Force 151 to respond to the issue of piracy and has engaged in counter-piracy activities with participating countries in a coordinated manner. As you may know, the number of piracy occurrences per year has been maintained role thanks to such international efforts and also to the open and stable seas. The third point is capacity building assistance and defense equipment and technology cooperation. In the Indo-Pacific region today, national sovereignty and the rule of law continue to be challenged by the range of criminal activities, including those by non-state actors such as terrorist groups, along with piracy and illegal fishing. While many countries are tackling these issues, one area that has come into focus as an effective way to maintain maritime order is the enhancement of maritime domain awareness. The Japan Ministry of Defense, Self-Defense Forces engaged in activities to support the region with MDA enhancement. The transfer of Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces, TC-90s, to the Philippines is a successful example. This program includes not only the transfer of aircraft itself, but also the cooperation in pilot training and maintenance support to the Philippines. The government of Japan as a whole also assists with capacity enhancement in this field, including by providing patrol vessels to Asian countries. We believe that such an effort will help coastal nations to develop capabilities, which in turn will bring greater stability to the region. These are just some of what JSDF is doing for peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region. We are confident that such effort will go a long way to contributing to the peace and stability of the region. As the international community faces a time of significant change, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean are fusing dynamically as free, open, and prosperous seas. We have a lot at stake in the peace and stability of this region. To enable the international community to benefit from the fruit of prosperity as a whole, cooperation between Japan, India, Australia, and the United States is very important for the global community. Please let me close my remarks today by expressing my resolve to work actively on various security challenges in concert with the international community and to further strengthen our relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Admiral Kawano. I'm going to call upon Dino, Patti, Djalal of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia as a first-time member to this, to both Raisina and to this grouping, to give us a new perspective, and you will give us a new perspective on how Indonesia, which is the largest country in ASEAN, looks at both the Indo-Pacific as a geopolitical construct, and how you think we should move to work to synergize in this region.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here in Raisina Dialogue, and thank you, Samir. I know he's sitting here someplace. And I have to compliment Raisina because first conference I've ever been to where the sessions run until midnight, last night and the night before, right? And tonight too, maybe. But, in Davos, at midnight, the only light you see is disco lights, right? So, right. Look, a couple of points I want to say. Yesterday we talked a lot about alliances, and today also. But the point that I want to stress to you is that the strategic spaces that will be created will not be by alliances, but by alignments, right? Alliances will not grow in numbers. They will more or less stay the same. But alignments are multiplying. Why is that? Because alignments is more flexible, less binding, does not require a treaty. It can be issues-based. It can change at any time. And it's easier to sell to the public. And you can have multiple alignments, which is harder to do with treaty alliances or treaty partnerships. So India, you have strategic autonomy. You can't have alliances, but you are much more aligned to the United States now. Indonesia and India, we have good relations, but now we are aligning much closer to one another. The Philippines is a treaty alliance of the United States, but somehow we see Philippines is getting aligned to China, right? And you see with Pakistan, we heard today about how the United States has so much presence in Pakistan, but we see Pakistan is getting more and more aligned to China, right? So I think we need to understand that if you are going to understand the strategic landscape in the future, alignments is going to be very much a bigger part of it, and I think more so than alliances. And this is something that China has done exceptionally well. The second thing is about Indo-Pacific region. I think after the speech by President Trump about the Indo-Pacific, now the word has a buzz again. You know, there's a new life to the word. And in Indonesia, we haven't used the term, officially in the last 3 years. But just about a week ago, the foreign minister talked about Indo-Pacific in a big way. So the key part about that speech by President Trump is about the Quad, and it's well represented here. But there's something I want to say about this. I was in China about 2 weeks ago, and this discussions that I had with the Chinese were that they were not comfortable with the Quad and not also with the national security strategy that was issued by the White House recently. They thought it had adversarial tone to it, right? So I think the key is with the Quad, with the Indo-Pacific strategy, how do you present it and walk it in a way that does not create more strategic distrust, right? So I think this is an important question. I mean, look, China cannot be checked. Just in the same way, India cannot be checked. India is going to keep growing militarily and strategically, just like the United States cannot be checked, and Russia cannot be checked. But the key, in my view, is not how do you check China or the United States or Russia or India, but how do you get them in a strategic framework, an architecture which is more conducive to cooperation and peace and constructive engagement. And here, unfortunately, there are no big ideas. There's a poverty of ideas. If you look at the East Asia Summit, for example, it's going well. They meet every year or so, but they're struggling to get to the next level. Even in my region, ASEAN talks about centrality and coherence, but ASEAN is struggling with a creative idea on this big vision, strategic vision thing, the next level after the ASEAN community. So that is one challenge, but it's not just about how to create big ideas, it's how you get there. The East Asia Summit is one example. East Asia Summit now is more or less one of the best architecture we have so far for Indo-Pacific, right? But if you look at the Asia Summit and how it got there, it is because it was proposed by a middle power like Indonesia. Yeah. If it was proposed by China, no one would accept it. If it was proposed by the United States, I don't think it would be accepted. It was proposed by Russia or Japan, the others would also reject it, right? But it was pushed by Indonesia, and we engaged India because we didn't want it to be dominated by China. And we got China in, and China was okay, so long as Indonesia was in the driver's seat. And then Russia and the United States joined, right? So that's how East Asia Summit happened as a regional architecture. And this reveals, I think, an important point. And I'm going to be sorry to be very blunt on this. What is it? It's so-called strategic ego, right? If you're going to quote me one day on this, this is where you heard it first, and you're most welcome. But people complain about strategic trust, but there's also such a thing as strategic ego, which means if China offers Belt and Road Initiative, the United States is not joining it. Why? Because joining it would mean you're accepting China's leadership in the region. And this is the same reason why the United States is not joining the AIIB, because joining it would be accepting China's leadership in the region. And the same thing for the Russians with the Eurasian Union. The others have this strategic ego, right? They're not gonna push it because it's not on their own, and because, like I said, accepting it would be accepting the other's leadership, right? So we're stuck with this situation whereby, on the one hand, you really need a regional architecture, right? But at the other hand, most of the major powers, or maybe all the major powers, the great powers, cannot make that strategic leap and mindset, right, to develop an architecture that is in need of reform, that is in desperate need of greater confidence building and some new type of relationship. I know President Xi Jinping talks about having a new type of great power relationship, obviously talking about the United States and China, but it's still, again, very much lacking in detail. And we don't know how much China means it as well. Right. So I'll stop there, and we'll take more questions later.
Certainly. Thank you, Dino. You've put out a number of new ideas on the table, and I will now request Admiral Tim Barrett, Chief of Navy of Australia, to back last.
All right, thank you. Thank you. At least I know the score. I can come in afterwards. Firstly, thank you to the organisers, and I wish to thank you on two reasons. You managed to find 4 of the tallest naval commanders in the region to all be on the stage at once, which is a big thing. The second, I have sat through a number of the panels, and I have been encouraged by the robust discussion. But the point I would make here in my opening statement is it was once said that the only thing harder than getting a new idea into the military mind is getting the old idea out. And I think that is important with the nature of some of the things that we should be discussing today. Contestability is good, and it will set the tone for a couple of things I would like to say. Much of the broad issues around nationalism, protectionism, anti-globalization, etc., have already been said, and I won't repeat them. But I'd like to make 2 points, or I'll end with 2 points. But firstly, I'll put a bit of an Australian perspective around it, and I'll start with a small story. About a decade ago, I attended the Tokyo Defence Forum, and I was there for 3 days, and every presentation that was made had a map, and every map in its southern border ended at the Indonesian archipelago, which meant Australia didn't feature at all. I had a lonely 3 days trying to convince people while I was there. And now I find myself at the end of a 5-speaker presentation, which is why in some reasons we sent a 6-ship deployment called Indo-Pacific Endeavour around the region last year to remind people that we have a part to play, not just in the region, but in a global perspective. It's important we do that because I heard our name mentioned as one of the significant liberal democracies in the area in a presentation about whether liberal democracy would survive into the future. But I'd like to briefly turn to what I think are the strategies, and we've heard most of them already today or in this session, that are in existence and will work. I call them, though, the usual suspects, and that is there is a regional security framework, but we have a plethora of fora. We have symposium, be it the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, be it the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, and I am indeed involved with what possibly might be the creation of something in the South Pacific as well. But there is the ADMM Plus, and there are numerous others. We also have a great emphasis on information sharing, not just white shipping, but grey shipping as well. The detail and depth of each of those things varies depending on which of these fora or symposium you attend. At the same time, we have a multitude of exercises. But I have to say, Most of them are relatively simple in design and in execution. And lastly, and importantly, we have a significant series of personal exchanges throughout the region. Now, all of those are good things. But I do spread a word of caution here, and I guess to some extent it's in a similar vein to what Admiral Harris was saying earlier. In aggregation, each of these have potential, but also in reality, an abundance of these institutions, organisations and arrangements, poorly managed or not aligned, actually produces a dilution of practical outcomes and is difficult for us to achieve meaningful outcomes for very pragmatic reasons. And it may well be as simple as asking the same nations to send the same ships to so many exercises that they run out of fuel. There is no supra-arrangement that seeks to coordinate or align activity. Now, I'm not proposing here that we develop one, but what I am saying is we need to be cognizant within each of these security or elements of the security framework just how far and where each of these should attend. The other aspect I think is important is to gain that alignment, it should have an alignment of purpose or around a purpose. And here I would recognise and applaud the work that has been done, particularly in India, around the definition and description of the blue economy. It's a statement that shows that this is not only a geopolitical issue, but is broadly effective across the whole of government, across many different nations. And in describing and discussing those broader issues, it puts a true purpose behind why we should seek security in certain elements. And it is not all around a military outcome. And I think where my view of the arrangements for the Quads at the moment, that is the cooperative talks that have already occurred in November last year, was around strengthening those relationships around economics and other areas that are just as important as considering the military side. Now, the strategic challenges that I think we face at the moment, as I've said, it's an abundance of arrangements. In doing this, though, there is also, I have a view, that there's a lack of hard outcomes. It's the difficult conversations, and again, Admiral Harris raised these. It's about making hard debate. It's about having diplomatic resolve to resolve issues. It's about following through on these issues. And I say this from about 3.5 years' experience as a Chief of Navy, the Australian Navy, having been party to many of these arrangements at the practitioner's level. So I think the areas that we have looked at, the strategies are sound. I think there is prospect. I think there is potential for them. But I also spread a caution as to how each of us enter into these arrangements, knowing that there has to be a meaningful outcome and there needs to be a sense of purpose as to why we're describing these. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Barrett. And I'm glad you mentioned the term meaningful outcomes, because if this has to work, it has to go beyond being a talking shop. I will go back to Admiral Lanba, because I wanted to ask you about how you mentioned both strategic autonomy and interoperability. And as we look at working with other countries, how do you expect to square these two ideals in the maritime space?
Interoperability is interoperability between navies and between platforms. And that is easy to do. There aren't too many ways you can run and operate a ship. And it's a common medium, so Navy to Navy, we understand each other very well. And when you exercise and practice together, you induct best practices from each other and procedures where interoperability increases. And I don't think so has got anything to do with strategic autonomy. That is a much larger concept, and that is strategic autonomy for the nation to pursue its national interests.
Admiral Harris, you spoke about 2018 being the year of courage and of the countries in this region to have the courage, or particularly India and the US, to have the courage to undertake some of the actions that you first spoke about in 2016. So if you could give us a sense of what it looks like for you in 2018, what are the actions that you think we should all be taking?
Well, I think if we look at the overarching theme of Raisina this year, Raisina 3, it's managing disruptive technologies or managing disruptive transitions. I believe that there are nations and entities afoot in the Indo-Pacific region that are disrupting the potential for prosperity, openness, and inclusivity. You know, our way ahead together as like-minded democratic nations, we are burdened by the immediate threat from North Korea, the long-term challenge that China poses, and the fact that terrorism is real in the Indo-Pacific region in 2018. So I think that the way ahead, the way to get at this is through multilateralism, because like-minded countries that work together are much stronger, much more apt to overcome those challenges that I mentioned and all the other challenges that we see throughout the region. So I would hope that in 2018 we work together, not just the nations that are represented here on the dais, but like-minded nations in the audience, to come to grips together with the challenges that we face, not only this year, but certainly in the decade ahead.
Admiral Kawano, I wanted to ask you about the long-term challenge that we see, the aggressive Chinese power that poses to us or to the nations of this region, and which, in a sense, has been the reason for the creation of something like the quadrilateral. If you had to define, how would you define that challenge from where you sit, and what, in your opinion, are some of the steps that we could take that keeps the quadrilateral from being merely a diplomatic effort?
Just a moment, please.
Yes, of course.
Mm. まず中国の今の行動というのはまず軍事費が急激に伸びている、それから、軍事力の活動範囲も今急激に拡大しているということがあります。
So I just want to say that Chinese military power has been becoming more and more powerful, and the country has expanded their operational regions.
で我々が一番問題にしているのは東シナ海、南シナ海で見られるように中国が国際法を無視して、一方的な現状変更をしているということです。
And what we are concerned about is that in the East and South China Sea, China has been neglecting international law and tries to change the status quo unilaterally.
で我々としては不測の事態を避けるために今日中の間の、海空連絡メカニズムの交渉中で、あります。
In order to avoid the accidental collision with China, right now, Japan and China has been trying to set up a Japan-China maritime and air contact mechanism.
ただこういう外交手段以外にやはり、中国の今の行動を抑え込むためにもインド、オーストラリア、アメリカ、日本という同じ価値観を共有し、国際法を尊重し、航行の自由を尊重するこれらの国、またプラス ASEAN の国々が協力をして、 中国の行動を抑止するということが必要だと思います。
And I think that in order to deter Chinese provocative action, it is very important for like-minded countries such as the United States, Australia, India, and Australia, and plus ASEAN member states, and Japan, and all ASEAN states, to cooperate with each other to deal with these issues.
Thank you, Admiral. Dino, you actually put out an interesting point of view, where you said that China really is the master of creating alignments, and in a sense, as we've seen, as you said, with the East Asia Summit, we are still the counter, or rather the balancing powers are still struggling to find a clearer agenda. But if you were to look at the agenda that we need, where would you be looking?
Let me comment on a term that I heard yesterday, alliance of democracies, right? Again, I think we need to be very careful about talking about alliance of democracies, because within ASEAN, I'm talking about the Southeast Asian perspective, anybody can be a member of ASEAN, no matter what the political system is. And we prove in ASEAN that no matter what your political color is, we can have peace, cooperation, and become one community. And I think for India as well, your foreign policy is not about exporting your democracy to other countries. So I think we got to be careful about terms like that. But there's definitely a trust deficit in the Indo-Pacific region. And in my view, there's still much scope for this to be overcome. And what it needs is leadership. The admirals and generals who are on the panel here today are carrying the policy of their government, and it's up for their leadership to show their statesmanship and vision for the region. I say this based on Indonesia's experience as well. There was a time when Indonesia saw Malaysia as our enemy during confrontasi, and also Singapore as our enemy. Right? But we had a mindset change, right? A change of strategic culture, and now between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, we have very good and strong relations. And the same thing with Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste parted from Indonesia, and there was a time when Indonesia did not want to do anything with Timor-Leste. It was just politically too difficult for our domestic, and there was a feeling of hurt and so on. But the leadership overcame that and led the people to think in the right way. And now Indonesia and Timor-Leste have the best of relationships. But one other point that I want to mention is that it's really critically important for the militaries in the region to get along and have healthy mil-mil relationships. Why do I say this? Because, look, now you have a new generation of political leaders throughout the region. Some have foreign policy agenda, others are more domestic oriented, right? But in the militaries, you still see signs of xenophobia, hard nationalism, conspiracy theories are rife, and so on and so on. And the more you engage them, the more they engage one another, and the more they develop confidence building, training, scholarships, and so on, the more you open up their mind, and the more you build the right building blocks for peace in the region. So in the absence of leadership, a healthy mil-mil relationship is really critical, because we don't talk about this often, but conspiracy theories, xenophobia, hard nationalism still exists in many of our militaries.
Hard nationalism also exists in China, so
absolutely,
I think we are all So, Admiral Barrett, do you agree that there is a trust deficit between the region, in the countries in the Indo-Pacific region?
Look, I would agree that there is. The issue is to find out why and with whom. I would, to some extent, challenge the issue around the military issue of how we get on. My experience is the military-to-military relationship among many countries is far greater than what we will see around the political sensitivities between countries. The engagement that already does occur, particularly with navies, is quite profound. The statement I made earlier is whether we are actually making the most of the vast array of exercises and arrangements that we do have across these areas. And I am aware from our own instances, even with the government in Indonesia in the last couple of years, that an issue that was caused by the military was later solved by the military, whilst the political side was still debating as to whether it could be solved. And that did come down to the fact that there was a built level of trust between militaries that could be relied upon when it was needed to solve a particular crisis that arose. But I do think, I think your statement around the trust deficit is raised beyond the militaries itself. And I think it is right to say there is a deficit. In part, it's because of a lack of inclusiveness or transparency in the motivations of some of the actions that we are seeing at the moment that we, the military, are asked on behalf of our governments to manage.
Thank you very much. And now we'll open this up to the audience. The first two questions will go to the Raisina Fellows, and Anton Setov and Virl Novens. So Anton, if you could get to a...
Does it work? Yeah. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Aura, for giving us this wonderful opportunity to contribute to the discussion. And my question will be primarily addressed to Dino. And
if you could speak up a little, please.
Of course, sure. My question will be addressed primarily to Dino, but I would, of course, welcome if any of the honorable naval commanders would respond as well. One could argue that essentially the interest towards the Quad and how many of us are here listening today, compelled by all these arguments, proceeds from the fact that it may be symbolizing one very important, a very disruptive transition in the Indo-Pacific and the East Asia, which is a slow deterioration of the multilateral institutionalized organizations and the architecture we have gotten used to. And Dino, you mentioned several of those, the East Asia Summit and the ADMM Plus and the IRF and the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Let's not forget about that one. And
the question is?
Yeah, would you say that, I'm getting to this, I'm sorry. Would you say that an emergence of a new and stronger and an actual Quad would mean the weakening of inclusive multilateral ASEAN-centered institutions? Because I'm very afraid that that may be the case in the course of the next 2 decades. Thank you very much.
Should we take the other question as well, and then maybe, yes, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Gerda Nowens. I work for a defense and security think tank in London. We've spoken about and heard about disruptive transitions. I would actually like to ask a question about disruptive technology, specifically in the outer space field. Obviously, your operations in the Indo-Pacific region greatly rely on outer space-based technology, for example, through C4ISR capabilities. Regardless of which coalition you build, regardless of which policy you pursue in the Indo-Pacific region. My question is, countries are investing in technology that is seeking to degrade these capabilities of their adversaries. I would therefore like to know, how are you working together to ensure that you can mitigate this challenge going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Dino, would you like to answer that question? Sure. And the second question, I think you could.
Well, you know, there's no doubt that when I was in China, the response was, is this going to be the new NATO of Asia, right? They were nervous about the Indo-Pacific strategy. And, you know, what I think is that I think between Belt and Road Initiative and the Indo-Pacific strategy, the leaders should begin to play more on the theme that this can be complementary rather than competitive. I think there's scope to say that, and I think the more they explore that, I think the better for regional architecture. But I think the last thing we need is for any of the members of the Indo-Pacific to feel defensive. And if you want to have an Indo-Pacific architecture, it has to be inclusive, and everybody has to be comfortable about it. Yesterday we talked about if big powers want to give up power willingly. And in my view, it's not about giving up power. It's about giving more spaces to new powers that are rising, including China and Indonesia, and find a workable format for it. I want to point out that it would be wonderful, for example, if they can find reasons to work together for a common project. I say this based on my experience. When I was in government, we had an Aceh tsunami. This is in the year 2005. And it was just, for me, for us in Indonesia, so wonderful to see the US Navy, the Chinese Navy, the Japanese Navy, the Indian Navy, and Australian and Singaporean navies working together to help Indonesian tsunami victims. So although there will always be elements of rivalries and competition, I think we should really try to find more cooperative projects that can get these militaries to work together. On piracy, there's a lot of reason to work together. On fighting viruses, on fighting transnational crimes, terrorism, and so on. I think these are the things that can realign nations, no matter what alliances they belong to.
Who would like to take the disruptive technologies? Please, go ahead.
あとこの地域の特徴として、どういうテクノロジーに投資するかということについては、私はやはり海上の安全保障に対する投資だと思います。
So considering the characteristic of the Indo-Pacific region, I think that the point or field we should invest technology is
Maritime security,
capability.
でそれは能力構築支援を通じてお互いの能力を高めるということも含めてです。
And I mean, through the effort of capacity building assistance program, we can mutually develop or improve our capabilities.
Thank you. The gentleman at the, you'll have to make your way to the microphones. So yes, go ahead. Yes.
It works. I'm Jonathan Ward from Atlas Organization. I wanted to ask about the future of the Chinese military presence in the Indian Ocean. If you look out over the next 10 to 15 years, what would it really take for the Chinese to fulfill basic military missions such as sealing protection, or as they put it in their military strategy, the protection of our overseas interests? I mean, what would that look like in terms of basing around the Indian Ocean region potentially, or maritime and logistics support, or just force structure? Thank you.
Thank you. Tanvi and then General Singh.
Tanvi Madan from Brookings. This is a question for Dino Djalal about the trust deficit. You mentioned the nervousness in China about things like the Quad. Arguably, the Quad wouldn't exist without concerns and they have nervousness about China. What do you think China's responsibility is to build trust with some of the other countries represented on the panel, but also in the region as a whole, including the one that you represent? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm General P.K. Singh. My question is to, it's great to see the chiefs of the Quad navies over here. My question is about addressing the issue squarely, and that is that China has been aggressively destabilizing the region. We may be doing a lot in HADR and anti-piracy together, but that does not address the actual security issue. As Admiral Harris said, this is the year of courage. So my question is to all of you on the dais, do we have the courage to tell the Chinese that there will be costs imposed if they break the laws? And my question to the Japanese Chief of Naval Staff is, the Chinese have been violating your territorial sovereignty. I think it's time that scrambling jets will not serve the purpose. Are you ready to take the next step forward? Because if you were to do the same thing on China, the response of the Chinese towards your transgressions would have been very different. Thank you. I'm
going to take a few more questions because I think we will be running out of time. So
okay, thank you very much. I'm Liu Zhongyi from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. I'm a researcher. I did research on Indo-Pacific, the so-called Indo-Pacific, for 4 years at least. And I found that it's just a concept. So I'm not concerned about the so-called Indo-Pacific. But today I would like to have a question to the 4 admirals. On one side, I found you argue that you would like to build a free and open order in the so-called Indo-Pacific region. But on the other side, you argue a Quad. You would like to build a Quad. I would like to know, is it inclusive and open? If China would like to apply for a membership of Quad, will it be accepted? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The young gentleman there.
Thank you, Ms. Bagchi. This is Kashish Parpiani from ORF Mumbai. My question is for Admiral Harris.
Keep it short, huh?
Yes.
We've got a whole lot of people.
Yeah. My question for Admiral Harris. In the broader pedagogy of American foreign policy, there is an anecdote that is often renunciated. In her advocacy for military intervention in the Balkans, Secretary Albright once looked at Colin Powell and said, what is the point of owning this super military you're always talking about if you can't use it? In this context, with respect to America's extremely high defense spending and power projection capabilities, do you think American foreign policy is all too militarized? Thank you.
Thank you. Abhijit? And then the gentleman.
My name is Abhijit Singh. I'm a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. I have 2 short questions. A lot of this Indo-Pacific talk, sir, is about a rules-based order, and it keeps coming up for discussion again and again. I want to know from the panelists, is there one understanding of these norms, principles, rules, protocols that will be used to define maritime conduct in the global commons? Or is it that all participants sitting here have a different understanding of what these rules is? Second, more importantly, if what we are seeing is alignments happen, and not alliances, is this going to be driven simply by tactical national interests, or is this going to be driven by a common vision for the region? Because if it is the former, then it would simply vanish in no time. Your thoughts?
Thanks. Admiral, Ambassador Sajanhar and the gentleman there, and that's it.
Thank you very much, Indrani. My question is to Mr. Djalal, you spoke about strategic ego, and you said you've already laid your claim on the intellectual property rights of that. That's fine. But I want to give you an example, and then that's my question.
Ambassador, could you please just give the question?
Very brief, India, as far as the 2 initiatives by China were concerned, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we are the second largest stakeholder in that. India proposed the setting up of the NDB, the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, but because our interests we thought were aligned with that. But we did not participate. India was the only major country which did not participate in the Belt Road Forum. So, would you say that strategic interests from strategic ego? Because if it was strategic ego, then even our participation in the first 2 initiatives would not happen.
Thank you. Sir, you're the last question.
Sorry.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me this last chance to give a comment, if you allow me to give, and also the question. Right. Well, as the Chinese, I think that we should go back to their history of Asian times, but not go back to the history of Europe. Regarding the European history, we know that there's some discussion about the go back to the 19th century of European history, talking about the balance of power, standoff between the powers. So it seemed to me that the Indo-Pacific region seems that builds the 2 blocks to stand up with each other. But I think that we should go back to the history of Asia. That means in Asian time, China, India, China, Southeast Asia, in the Asian time, that, strangely, 100 years ago, was in their past, like the finance or coexisting. China, India, Myanmar already work together in an Asian country. So that means that we could collaboration or combination between the ocean and the continent, between the East Asia and Asia and South Asia. So my suggestion that, my question to our panelists is that, is it possible that in the Pacific region could be combined with the Asian continent?
Thank you. I'm going to give last closing remarks to our panelists. We are running really short of time, so just answer the questions that you felt were addressed to you or that you want to answer, and make that your closing comments. Admiral Harris, let me begin with you.
Yeah, so that's my favorite kind of question. Just answer the one you want, even if it wasn't asked. So I'm gonna just take a wide swath of the questions that were either asked or I wished were asked, because those are the ones that I'll answer. About China, I believe the reality is that China is a disruptive transitional force in the Indo-Pacific. They are the owner of the trust deficit that we all have spent the last hour or so talking about. While there are common threats in the region for sure, that we all can work together to overcome, including with China. And these are things like disasters, humanitarian assistance, and disaster response, which China has, in fact, been helpful in Hainan, Typhoon Hainan in the Philippines, and the like. Piracy. China has been helpful in countering piracy in the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Aden region. Terrorism. We should be appreciative and complimentary of China's efforts in all of these areas. But how defensive do you think Vietnam is, and rightfully so, when China sends a major oil research platform into Vietnam's legitimate exclusive economic zone? How defensive is Malaysia when China claims the South Laconia shoals clearly within Malaysia's EEZ? How defensive should the Philippines feel when China claims the Second Thomas Shoal and the Scarborough Reef and the like? So that's in my view, the trust deficit that China, more than any other country, can help overcome throughout the region. To the question that the gentleman asked earlier, or the lady asked rather, which I think is a great question, about Madeleine Albright's comment about the military and what good is the military if you're not willing to use it. Thank you for the question. I think some people would think that we use our military quite a bit. But I'll say that, do I think that American foreign policy is over-militarized? And I believe the answer to that is no. But I do believe, as Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson have articulated often and recently, that diplomacy has to be the main battery. Diplomacy is the first effort, and whether that's the issue of North Korea or other challenges that face all of us and face the United States. However, I believe that clearly that diplomacy must be backed by credible military power. If you have diplomacy that is not backed by credible military power, then you really have a hollow negotiating point. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you. Admiral Lanba.
There was an issue raised about China's, the PLA Navy's presence in the Indian Ocean region the next 10 years. Since 2008, there has been a sea change in the deployment pattern of the PLA Navy. They've stepped out from the Western Pacific and the First Island chain and been operating in the IOR. On an average, at the moment, they have the anti-piracy group, which consists of a tanker and 2 frigates, and 3 or 4 research vessels, either survey or hydrographic vessels. They made the first overseas base of facilities in Djibouti. And I think this is the kind of presence which is going to be there in the Indian Ocean for the foreseeable future. As far as naval bases in the Iowa region, it's still an open question. They have invested money in port facilities, which in my opinion are uneconomically viable. And you can take the name of Hambantota, but there is no Chinese naval presence, and that is what we've been promised, and I think that is what the deployment pattern is going to be in the near term.
Thank you. Admiral Barrett.
There was an array of questions there. I won't seek to answer any of them in particular.
You have to make your closing remarks as well.
Let me say I still have faith in the regional framework that we mentioned earlier. I reiterate my comment that we need to use it effectively, but to use it effectively in the spirit of removing a trust deficit, there needs to be more transparency in the motivations behind some of the actions we're seeing. And I'll just use one brief example. I mentioned earlier in my presentation that my Navy actually sent a deployment through the region at the end of last year, and its very existence was questioned. We were very open and advertised the fact that this was occurring, and we were meeting with partners that we've been exercising with for the previous 70 years. And 10 years ago, there wouldn't have been a question, but last year there was. The situation has changed in the region. We need for the Regional Security Forum framework to be able to accommodate that, but it does require transparency on both sides to be able to effectively manage those existing arrangements.
Admiral Kawano.
ランバ大将が言われた通り、中国の一帯一路のこれは経済の問題として捉えてますけども、この一帯一路の構想と同時に、中国の軍事活動も一緒に伴っているというところに警戒すべきだと思っています。
Just like Admiral Lanba just said, I think that China's One Belt, One Road initiative seems to be One Belt, One Road initiative seems to be economic initiative, but actually it has military aspects as well.
それともう一つ今の中国の国際法を無視した行動を実力によって変えるというのは難しいかもしれません。
And I also think that it may be difficult to change the Chinese policy, which has been promoting its military action by neglecting international law.
ただそういうことをやることによって自分たちは孤立するんだという環境を作ることで中国の行動を変えさせるということはできると思います。
But if we could create an environment that if China continues these actions, the country could be isolated. This is an important thing, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The last word to you, Dino.
Okay, well, all of Southeast Asia is becoming very close economically to China. But I tell you that strategically we're very cautious. We still remember when China did the reclamation on the islands, everybody protested, even the United States and Japan, and everybody protested. But China went on no matter what, and I think the message was very clear, that no matter who you are and what you say and how you protest, we're going to go on building these reclamations. And we were not comfortable with that at all. And for Indonesia, we've been having a problem with the Natuna because the Chinese government has stated recently that the 9 dash lines overlap with our waters in Natuna, which prompted us to rename some parts of the Natuna Islands. But for the first time in Indonesia's history, China is claiming our waters, and we're not comfortable with that at all. In fact, we reject it. So how do we get China to build more trust and to prove its good intentions? When I was in China, we told this to the people that we met. comply with the norms, with the rule of law, exercise self-restraint, treat everybody like your equal partner. Don't treat your neighbors as if you're the big brother, right? Treat us like your friend, right? But the region belongs to us, right? And regional countries are masters of our own regional affairs. But one test for China is how they behave and how they respond to the efforts to finalize the code of conduct. After so many years, I think 10 years, we only came up with a framework. And that's not good enough. I know it's been hailed as progress, but progress that takes 10 years for something that is rather vague. And I think the ability of China to come together with ASEAN to finalize the code of conduct in a very clear and progressive and speedy way would be one of the tests by which we measure China's regional intention in the region.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all for being a great audience.